Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Voting Trend Podcast. My name is Dave, and as always, I'm joined by Carter Krishnaiyer. And today we have a lot of elections to talk about. We have the Canadian election, we have the Australian election, we have the British by-election. So this is going to be a little bit of a longer podcast than usual. Just to remember, go ahead and sign up for Voting Trend on Substack. So that's Voting Trend, Substack.com. But then also, if you're very interested in Canadian politics, Kartik and I do the 11th province, which is the 11th province at .substack.com. So please go ahead, go to those, sign up. It's free to sign up for those. It'd be great to have your support. So we're going to first delve into the Canadian election, mostly because it was the first one. And we've written a lot about it. We've talked a lot about it on the 11th province, but we haven't done a podcast on it yet. So this is the first time we've kind of done this format on the Canadian election. Now, the one thing I want to say, let's just look at the results at first. Okay. So the results ended up being 169 seats. Well, it's kind of, we don't know if it's going to be 169 or 168 for the Liberals, because there is this one Quebec seat, as Kartik and I had talked about before, is kind of going back and forth. I don't know if they've got that finalized yet.
It's in a judicial review
right
now.
Right. So
the Bloc could win it.
Right. And it's weird because I am on the Globe and Mail right now, and it was at 168 a few hours ago. Now it's back up to 169. So I don't know if there's some other counting or if a review is finished or whatever, but let's just say 168, 169. Conservatives are at 143, Bloc Québécois at 23, the NDP at 7, and the Green Party at 1. So with that being the case, Mark Carney's Liberals win. And I'll go ahead and let you start off with this, because I think my view on this election is very, very different than the view of all of a sudden amateurs in the United States pontificating on Canadian elections, right? So you go ahead and start, because I'm going to probably say things that are probably unpopular.
I don't know that they're unpopular. I mean, I think I have similar takes to you. I do think it's a victory for Mark Carney and the Liberals. Okay, so maybe that's a little different than your take. Although I do think it's a victory which could either be a short-term victory, or it could indicate some degree of realignment. A realignment that also benefits the Conservatives in some respects. So that's something to look at. I think we're going to get flushed into that deeper. This is a reminder to those who don't follow Canadian politics, which is specifically people in the US and the UK weighing in on the elections. Now, I have to say the people in the UK know a little more than the people in the US about Canada. So I'm not trying to make a false equivalency there. But I do also think people in the UK know Mark Carney really well. Political people in the UK, maybe as well as he was known in Canada, maybe better prior to the last few months. So there's some wish casting about Carney that's going on in the UK that maybe is a little over the top, is where I would put it. But Canadian elections tend to be regional. Canada and the federal level in Canada is very different than the provincial level, and how voters vote and what they vote based on at the federal level is very different than the provincial level, which is not what we see in the United States anymore, where people have generally become straight party voters. Now, it was that way in the United States in the 1980s. I remind people, Ronald Reagan's second term, Democrats controlled 34 of the 50 governorships, which may shock people now thinking about it. But there was a certain acceptance that Republicans were better for national defense, better for Cold War considerations, better on foreign policy. That's the federal government. And Democrats were better on state and local issues. Every day, picking up your trash, Democrats were better at that. That is, in Canada too, and we're going to get to the council elections in the UK where those are issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the most important thing coming out of this election is you had a regionally strong left party in the NDP in Western Canada, which was basically the competition for the Conservatives, or this version of the Conservatives, right? The Reform Party, merged. Maybe we have to go through the history for some of the American viewers. We'll do that later. But this version of the CPC, their major competition in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia and Manitoba,
Yeah.
has been in all four of those provinces has been the NDP. We're used to the Liberals finishing third in those provinces in federal elections and in provincial elections, and the NDP and Conservatives competing for the provincial elections. The complete collapse of the NDP vote in those places did benefit the Liberals.
Right.
The Liberals got 28% in Alberta. They've been in the low single digits often since the Stephen Harper elections, right? Um, they've they've been off. They had no support in Saskatchewan and very little in Manitoba. They got over 40% in Manitoba this time. The Liberals really
Mhm.
significant. That's an NDP vote collapse. So that's one. So that benefited the Liberals. But then when you get to Ontario, to the urban ridings where the NDP has been very strong. In Ontario, they've been strong on the Isle of Montreal. I guess that benefited the Liberals, but they've been
Mhm.
strong in urban centers in Ontario. That vote collapse, Dave, and I think you and I agree on this, and I've seen very little analysis of this otherwise. There's some, but not much. That really benefited the Conservatives. So I think
Right.
one of my big takeaways is young, urban voters who are in either the gig economy or are kind of economically tied to the United States in how they work and how they make their living. They're young professionals are shifting from left, the NDP, to center right, the Conservatives. And remember, the Conservatives, the progressive Conservatives, just won a huge provincial majority in Ontario. Granted, there was a significantly lower turnout in that election. So actually, Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives got, I think, maybe a million more votes in Ontario. I have to do the math, but I think it's like a million more votes they got than Doug Ford's PCs did 2 months ago. But there's a shift of young professional voters to the Conservatives, which I think is part of a larger problem for the Liberals. The Liberals won this election, Dave, and I'll close on this before we get into kind of all the permutations. The Liberals did win this election, but the Liberals won this election partly because they got traditionally conservative voters over the age of 65. Many of them, I think they got basically a 50-50 split among those people instead of it being 70-30 conservative. And then between the ages of 50 and 65, the Liberals did really well, really, really well. I think that might be a one-time deal with this specific election and the United States and the anti-Americanism, or it might be Carney being a technocrat is a more reassuring figure for older, more mature people than Justin Trudeau was. Now, if that's the case, then we may be looking at a realignment, but I don't know yet. But so those are that. I mean, those are all things that are to be determined.
Right. I mean, if as far as a win or not, to me, okay, Mark Carney's formed a government. Obviously, if we're looking at what technically counts as a win, it's a win. If you have a football game and you win by a field goal at the end and that gets you up by 1 point, that's a win. Okay, that wins you the Super Bowl. It's a Super Bowl, right? Uh, the question is what was expected compared to what the outcome was. Okay, and this is where I think the American media is kind of just missing the boat. And they're treating this as a huge victory. Okay, now it's bigger than what it was, what we were expecting when Justin Trudeau was leader. Okay, a few things transpired during that time. But I've always said that if the Liberal Party has a very, very, very strong showing, talking about 185 seats, 190, possibly 200, that would be a Trump election. Like people fearing Trump. They're like, we fear Trump. We have to vote for the Liberals. We have to vote for Mark Carney. If it became a weaker Liberal election, it was not about Trump because that means two things. One, more people are voting for conservative. And two, the conservative message wasn't about defeating Trump, but it was very much focused on cost of living and other things as well. So this goes back, and again, Americans, sorry, not every single election is focused on you. Okay, and to me, this is a pure election result that shows that this election really wasn't about Trump with a number of voters. Yes, Trump has an impact. Obviously, the decisions he makes has an impact on tariffs, on the 51st state bullshit and stuff like that. Obviously, we have that. Okay, so there's no doubt about that. And it was more of an impact in Canada than obviously Australia. Okay, but it was a weaker result to me, meaning that it was not a Trump driven election. And with that being said, we'll talk about the collapse of the NDP because it's going to be the hardest one. It's kind of going to be the hardest nut to crack, I think, because we don't have this pure shift. And this comes to a point, I think, with political science in general, which is that we can no longer look at this median voter theorem. This, oh, if you're located at this point of the spectrum, you're going to go to who the closest person is on this or that point of the spectrum. We're not there anymore. I think it's kind of a very one-dimensional way to look at politics, but with the ever-changing dynamic in politics, you are seeing that you just cannot cleanly classify people on a left-right continuum. And so I think right now we're seeing that with the NDP vote in Canada, because I mentioned, hey, listen, and I wrote this article in the 11th province. I said, hey, listen, let's say you're from West Windsor, you work for a trucking company, and you've always voted NDP. But now you're told, hey, this is a two-way race. You're told that the NDP can't do anything. And you always voted NDP, but all you see is the NDP hanging out on college campuses talking about Gaza or sitting there talking about identity politics. You're going to leave. They're no longer the party of the working class. Okay? You look at the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party has a central banker. Okay, and I think it is very, I mean, we talked about this. I think it's very important to notice there's a difference between, like, being the governor of the Bank of Canada and England versus like the chairman of Goldman Sachs. But then you reminded me that he worked for that. But then the whole Cayman Islands thing and everything,
Yeah.
it just makes it look like Carney is not for me. So then what does that do? That leaves the conservatives. And this is the same thing that had happened with Trump, is that the Democrats were so out of touch with the average person in the United States that a lot of voters said, hey, Trump is a nut, but he at least understands that I can't afford shit right now. I can't buy a house. I can't buy a car. I can't buy groceries. I can't do this. My wages aren't going up. I'd rather have someone that breaks the system. And those people won over.
And these are people, I need to remind folks who are just obsessed with ideology, these are people who never voted for George W. Bush, right? They voted for Al Gore. They voted for John Kerry. They voted for Barack Obama twice. And then they switched. And they've stuck with Trump. And I know a lot of people who are on the far left, who I thought were lunatics on the left, that are Trump backers now. I don't know that many people who are moderate, like, hey, I voted for Bush once, voted for Obama once, that are voting for Trump. Those people are now all Democrats.
Right.
They all voted for Harris. So the ideological thing, I think, in my mind, I think in your mind, in my mind, Dave, because we studied this for a while, the idea that NDP voters could vote for the Tories, could vote for the Conservatives, makes perfect sense to us. But I think in the last 6 days, we're now 6 days from the election as we record this, so many other analysts are having trouble comprehending what happened. What happened in York Center? What happened in the area in Windsor West? What happened in Kitchener? What happened in Hamilton? Right, where the Greens lost the seat. Right. What happened in the areas, just kind of what we call the collar counties around Chicago, if it's Chicago, the areas surrounding Richmond Hill, another one, right? Richmond Hill, Toronto area. What happened in those places? And we don't have all the data yet. I have to stress that. But to Dave and I, it looks like the NDP vote collapse actually benefited the Conservatives in Ontario. And where NDP voters transferred to the Liberals, places like the heart of Toronto, places like the heart of Ottawa, that just meant the Liberals ran up the score in those places.
But
and
then
their
also
vote became less efficient as a result.
But we also don't know, and I don't think we would know, because we can't look at individual data, how many people from the NDP previously just stayed home, and then how many new voters got activated, because there can be that dynamic there. Okay, so
Yeah.
that's something that we got
Unless
to
you have
look at because
100% turnout, you know, right? I mean,
right, exactly. And even 100% turnout is going to bring new people in, and people die from the
yeah,
last
well, right,
election. I
right,
mean,
that too, yeah.
it's just what it is. And this goes back to the election here in the United States, presidential one, because it was you and I when I was down there in Broward County, and we were there at was that the Coral Springs early voting location, or was
Yes.
that?
Which is a
And I
very
looked at the
democratic area historically.
right, and I see these two Andrew Tate looking kids in line with their MAGA hats, which Kartik and I were kind of like, hey, isn't that against the rules? Campaigning within this amount, this distance from the door. Apparently, people didn't care, and it was it was like at that exact moment that I got worried. I was not worried until I saw it, and I was like, holy shit, they're actually motivating these Andrew Tate types to actually go out and vote.
It's possible those
And
people had never voted, those two guys had never voted before. Very
right,
possible.
right. I mean, and they weren't let's say necessarily young enough that they couldn't have voted in another
Yeah,
election.
yeah.
Okay,
They're probably in their
and
30s.
right, and this comes to the whole point. I mean, a lot of parties are in trouble right now. I think in Canada, I don't think for people to say Mark Carney's in a good position. He is for a year because the Bloc Québécois basically said, hey, we're not going to do anything with a vote of confidence or whatever until a year from now. We'll see what happens. So he's good for a year. He's prime minister for a year. Unless something catastrophic happens with Quebec, I don't think that's going to change. The NDP is going through a leadership change, and who knows how that party is going to go. So there's not going to be a change with Mark Carney. So the Liberals are in trouble, I think, being a minority, but they're safe for now. The question is, for me, and maybe we'll talk about the NDP in a second, but I think what's more intriguing is what's going on in the Conservative Party. I thought that there was going to be a civil war triggered, and there has not been. And what I do find interesting is that Pierre Poilievre could have asked an MP from BC or Manitoba or Saskatchewan or Ontario or probably even Quebec to leave. But he's going for a riding in Alberta. And does that mean that the party changes what it stands for by going to the province where, and I don't know this riding as well, but it was what, 80 some percent, 70
Yeah,
some
yeah. I think
percent, 80
it was
yeah,
apparently the most conservative riding in the country.
right. Where, you know, Western alienation and Alberta sovereignty is probably a big issue. Um, how does that impact him as a leader? Is the question I have. Because I think after the election, I wrote about this today on the 11th province. I think after the election, the conservatives realized they had a tone problem, but I don't think they realized that they have other types of problems. And so everyone got on the BBC or the CBC, and they haven't been on the CBC before, but Andrew Scheer and others get on there, smile, do things. They realized that they needed to do some damage control. But him going to Alberta, Pierre Poilievre going to Alberta, to me, there might be kind of an expectation. You're an Alberta MP now, you better be talking about the West. And that would be the same thing. If you're a Quebec MP, you better be talking about Quebec. Whereas I think in the other provinces, you can get away with a pan Canadian view of everything. So I don't know. I maybe I'm looking too much into that, but I'm
No,
just wondering, what do you
I'm
think
not.
that him being in Alberta, it's going to create some expectations from him to do something that is going to focus on Alberta. At the end of the day, I think that hurts him.
It might. I mean, I mentioned to you yesterday the irony, privately, the irony that Polyev is the first really Quebecois speaking French, speaks French, conservative leader in a
Mhm.
long time that speaks French with a Quebecois accent, speaks Quebecois French, not metropolitan French, not, Parisian French. Um, and he did worse in Quebec than anyone. This is the first time we've talked about this over and over again. First time the
And
liberals
against
went.
Carney, who is one of
Yeah,
the
exactly.
worst.
That's the point
Yeah,
I'm going to make. Who
yeah.
doesn't speak good French, is not from Quebec, as most liberal leaders are, isn't even from Ontario, is from Western Canada, and Carney ran up the score in Quebec for some reason. Where the Quebecois And I think there were a lot of Bloc and Party Quebecois voters on the provincial level voted for the Liberals, saying, "Hey, protect us from the Conservatives." That was the
Yeah.
message.
Yeah.
Protect us from these Western Canadians. Partly, that's part of it. So there's already a feeling in Quebec. This is what I was leading into. I think there was already a feeling in Quebec, explained by these election results, that the Conservative Party, this version of the Conservative Party, the CPC, not the old Progressive Conservatives, is a Western Canadian party. And
Well, yeah, and
go
mhm.
ahead, go ahead.
Well, and I think with Quebec, another thing is too is with the exception of a few ridings in and around Quebec City, most former Bloc Québécois voters knew if I'm going to change or if this riding is going to change, it's going to go to the Liberals. And if my goal is to make sure the Conservatives don't get in there, I can still vote Bloc Québécois. Okay, because that's just because my riding really doesn't have anything. And again, it was only those ones in and around
And
now
in other
maybe
other
there are
places, I think in
like
Quebec, people,
Trois Rivières.
yeah,
You might have seen where because I think with Trois Rivières there was the expectation that the conservatives would win. They
well,
did
they ran a
not.
very popular. They had a very good candidate, the former mayor
Right.
there.
So and this is where Mark Carney needs to realize that he has a minority right now, but he is the largest party because of what happened
Oh, I
in
think he
Quebec.
knows that part, and I
Yeah.
think this is why the Bloc is saying we're going to give it a year, because I think they expect Carney to deliver for Quebec, which he very well might.
Right.
And if you take Quebec out of this election, the Conservatives win. And in fact, if
Well,
you take Quebec
yeah.
out of this election, the Conservatives might have a majority. I mean, I
Oh
haven't done
yeah.
the math, but they might be not only forming the next government, they might have a majority. So, um, but that's very bad for the Conservative Party that they can't compete at all in Quebec, and that Quebecois voters, voters who might want independence, are making the calculation. Okay, we're not going to be independent tomorrow, so we've got to make a calculation who's going to protect us at the federal level, and we just can't have a conservative government, and we can't have American encroachment. The U.S. is another part of the issue, I think more of an issue in Quebec than it was in other parts of Canada. When you say,
Right.
well, it wasn't all decided by the American issue, I think in Quebec it had a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
So going to Western
I think
Canada,
also
yeah, go ahead.
and also with that because you are talking about it literally having that border with New York, with Vermont,
Yeah,
with Maine. So I mean, trade is very specific and it might technically be a longer border because when you think of Ontario, you have these ports of entry that are then buffered by lakes.
yes,
Right. So
that's true.
so
It's
I
a
think
straight
with
border in Quebec, right? The St.
right,
Lawrence
exactly.
River cuts inland. Obviously,
Right,
all
it
this.
cuts inland exactly. As soon
Yeah,
as it cuts inland, and that's even in Ontario. But I do think you're right. There is a there Quebec didn't really change, but it kind of changed everything at the
yeah,
same time. Another thing I think we're going to look at, we'll see if the Parti Québécois, if their promise of if they're elected, they're going to do a referendum on sovereignty. We'll see if they go through with that. I think this result makes it that yes, you're more likely to do that. I don't know what the goal of it is. I
and
mean
remember
that's a
the
different
Parti
election.
Quebecois, just for the American watch viewers, they don't run candidates at the federal level. So
No.
they are a sovereigntist party, much as the Bloc is. The Bloc
Mhm.
runs part of candidates at the federal level. So just so you understand
Right.
what Dave's saying.
And they're separate parties totally,
Yeah, correct,
but
correct,
it's
correct.
like it's like it's like yes and no. Right. It's kind of like they are separate party, but their ideologies are the same. With their raison d'etre. I mean, I don't know as much as if it is now, but sovereignty being that. But
So
yeah,
sovereignty is so getting back to sovereignty in Western
right,
Canada.
right. That's
Polyev
where I was
going to
going.
Western Canada. Now there's things in Polyev's leadership style. We compare him to his. You mentioned Andrew Scheer, who was his, twice removed predecessor, or once removed predecessor, I should say. Let me get my terminology right. Aaron O'Toole's the guy in
Mhm.
between, and Aaron
Yeah.
O'Toole, at the beginning of COVID, decided he was going to support the government on various things. Right? He was going to have kind of an open dialogue where conservative MPs could sound off. which maybe was his undoing eventually. He
Oh.
was going to, even be tough on Trudeau, saying, "Hey, maybe we should close the border. Maybe we should be stronger on COVID." So Polyev comes in, and he becomes a radical on COVID. He supports the truckers, and I have to say, there's no dissent within the conservative caucus. My understanding is the sort of open conversations they had when Aaron O'Toole was the leader, the sort of, okay, the CBC, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, they're asking us questions. CPAC, right, which is, public affairs.
C-SPAN of
Yeah, yeah,
C-SPAN
C-SPAN of
of
Canada.
Canada, right?
They're asking us questions. Let's talk to them. Now, conservative MPs on Polyev's instruction will walk right by the cameras, right by the
Yep.
reporters. They're hostile to the mainstream media. That all
But not
changed.
now. Now that's
Now, the
changed
last
because,
four
like I
days,
said,
that's changed, right? Okay.
that's changed, right?
But Polyev
Andrew
didn't
Scheer
do
on
any.
CBC.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Polyev didn't do any interviews with mainstream media, right? They were the enemy. It was very
Right.
Trumpy. It was very populist,
Yeah.
which was not the way it was just under the last leader, Aaron O'Toole. And I think
Right.
maybe now the conservatives realize what I'm getting at is while their orientation is shifted right because of Western Canada and Polyev now moving to Alberta, confirms that they now
Right.
realize they have to engage in the debate. They did not engage in the debate. They gave the liberals a pass. And another thing that I guess is important to understand is that by not engaging in the debate, where the trust of the mainstream media is not like it is in the United States or the UK, right?
Right.
Canada, there's still a trust in those institutions. And by not engaging, they allowed the liberals to define that. Now,
No.
that has created more resentment in Western Canada. And I know now, they're conservatives in Alberta talking about how basically the entire media is funded by the liberal government and all these conspiracy theories and all this
Oh yeah.
nonsense. Um, so, can the conservatives be a true federal party if they have anchored themselves to Alberta? That's a really ongoing question. But Dave, the NDP vote collapse again. Getting back to that, ultimately, while those votes went to the Liberals, most of them in Western Canada, unlike in Ontario, um, it eliminates the other party that could win provincial governments or
Right.
beat them in many of those ridings. So for now, they may have this easy run up um, in Western Canada where they don't face serious electoral competition if the party holds together, which the Liberals don't have anywhere. Everywhere they
Right.
face serious electoral competition, other than maybe in some parts of Atlantic Canada. Um, but the question then, Dave, go is the NDP vote collapse permanent or is it a one election thing? If it's a one election thing, then then maybe the conservatives aren't in as great shape as we think they are.
Well, let me mention two things on that, and we'll talk about the NDP. Well, let me go ahead and first talk about Alberta, and then we'll get to the NDP because that's another conversation in itself. First of all, I'm going to call bullshit on Alberta separatism, or they say sovereignty. I call it separatism. Okay, because now you see a lot of these people who support separatism all of a sudden saying, "Oh, Mark Carney won. We need to separate from Canada." So, really, Mark Carney, a guy who was prime minister during a prorogued parliament and who has just taken over as prime minister and has done nothing except have press conferences because it's only been a few days, somehow his election triggered it that you need to separate. What has he done to make you want to separate? Right? I mean, it was just a pure bullshit reaction to an election result you didn't like. Whereas, let's look at Quebec and let's look at the separation history of Quebec. Okay, Quebec had issues throughout the 1980s with the Constitution and with the Constitution being approved without their approval. It caused them problems with both obviously Trudeau. It caused them problems with Brian Mulroney. I mean, a lot of people, you have to remember that when Brian Mulroney was prime minister, tons of seats in Quebec, including his own riding was in Quebec. But then Lucien Bouchard, who ended up, founding and creating the Bloc Québécois, he came from the Mulroney government. He did not come like Trudeau. So a lot of the Bloc Québécois originally came from the progressive conservatives. And then you have Jean Chrétien, who is part of the what they call in Canada the Night of the Long Knives, where they go in there and figure out the Constitution without Quebec and with the other provinces. And it was Jean Chrétien, which was his right hand man. So there was, once he became prime minister, there was a connection to Trudeau, like screwing over Quebec, and it literally was Jean Chrétien who did the screwing over. He's the one that went into the kitchen and made the deals, right? So
Yeah.
he was actually, so there are actually reasons, and this doesn't even include all the historical reasons
And the
of
liberals, I
what.
should mention, are the most kind of federal party. So it's not like, if you're watching from the UK and you think of the Unionist Party being the Conservatives, which they are. The Labor has been anti-imperial, and until Tony Blair, more or less kind of a socialist slash communist party in some respects.
Right.
The Liberals in Canada have been the more federal party. So for Quebecois to support the Liberals is really kind of, to me, newsworthy, because
Right.
they're the most unionist party, if we want to use that term, use the British term.
Right. Well, I just want to say, like, what the Quebecois, it's been a crescendo, at least to 95. It's been a built up of something. So prior to the Party Quebecois, there was a lot of discrimination amongst, against francophones in basically every aspect of life in Quebec. And we're talking about Montreal too. That you couldn't get a government job, you couldn't get a private sector job or anything unless you were bilingual. Okay, it required you to be bilingual. So it moved from that to saying, to forming the Bloc Québécois, or to forming the Parti Québécois, to the airing of those grievances, to the Parti Québécois winning in 1976, and then they had the 1980 referendum, which I think was just a referendum kind of to see how things would go. I don't think there was any chance of winning that, but everything has built up to that point. And when you take the constitutional issues and you take the discrimination issues of the past, there's a reason why we see Quebec doing what they are. For Alberta, there's no reason. Oh, we don't like the results and we have oil. So, you're alienating us. Okay. What
And but
it's
I think
such bullshit.
but they're influenced by American culture in Western Canada, I think,
Right.
more than in Ontario and Quebec. And I think that's the key, because culturally,
Yeah.
as you and I feel every day, the United States and Canada, I used to consider us kind of one country. And I would say the things Trump's saying, actually, we're one country with kind of an artificial boundary. I used to feel that way very strongly. I felt
Right.
Canadians were Americans and Americans were Canadians. Now, I think if you're from Eastern Canada, you're having less and less in common with the United States. But if you're from Western Canada, you're really influenced by American culture and American behavior and American music and American, and from my perspective, not the good things about America. Really, you're influenced by the
Right.
bad things.
Well, and one can even say that the whole idea of quote unquote Western alienization, when it started with the Reform Party and Preston Manning, was not economic, it was cultural. Because if we look at the Reform Party
Yeah.
and then the Canadian Alliance, it was that they were the pro-life people, they were the people connected to the church, they were that, whereas the progressive conservatives were not.
And let me
Okay, they
remind
were,
people, Pierre Poilievre is on record being pro-choice. So
well,
how he
the
fits in
party like
Alberta,
literally says, right.
yeah, how he fits in Alberta, I don't know. I mean, I thought about that right away when they made the decision on this riding 2 days ago, as we record on
Because he
Sunday.
could have gone anywhere.
He
Could
could have
have
gone
gone
anywhere. Right.
like why not ask somebody in Southwest Ontario, to where you just picked up ridings. Okay, now you don't have to defend it, because see, here's the thing: you're only needing a riding for now. Get one of those safer ridings in Southwest Ontario. Don't go for the Windsor one, or London Fanshawe, or any of those close ones. Go for one of the closer ones. Go for Simcoe, like one in Simcoe or up by Barrie or something like that. Take one of those, and you don't have people questioning why you picked Alberta. Because I think, and the question is, how much is Alberta going to influence him? Now, Maybe not, because I think we need to remember Stephen Harper was from Ontario, went over to Alberta, but he moved to Alberta. It wasn't like he had to be parachuted over there, right? He
Yeah.
moved there, he ran, but he's originally from Ontario. Um, and I would say during his tenure as prime minister, there wasn't the Western alienation grievances, even though he came from the Reform Party. But once the party merged, it kind of seemed like that went away. And maybe this is the compromise that needs to be met. If Pierre Poilievre is a MP from Alberta, then that keeps the party together. If he had been an MP in in Ontario, then all of a sudden you might have Reform Part 2 start coming up. Maybe by planting him there, that ends the Reform Party Part 2 thing. Maybe. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. But with that being the case, let's go over to the NDP, who are um, they're in trouble. They a lot of big names lost. It'll be interesting to see where their party goes because, I mean, in a bad way, kind of. You
I
usually one
just
thing.
wanted to interject one more point about the
Okay.
Conservatives, real quick. Jamil Giovanni, who we know is very close, actually used to be very close to JD Vance in terms of
Mhm.
American politics.
And he
But if
still is, I think.
oh, is he
Yeah.
okay? Yeah, I would think he would want to distance
Personally,
himself
at
from
least.
Vance
No,
at
I
this
mean,
point.
personally,
But
probably. Yeah.
Jamil Giovanni is very close to Polyev, right? We know that.
Right.
He went on this epic rant on the CBC attacking Doug Ford,
Yeah.
um, which really caught me off guard. I did not expect that. And obviously, Ford and Ford's provincial progressive conservatives in Ontario snapped back in a very kind of more diplomatic way. But when you've got Ontario MPs and prominent faces in the party like Giovanni now attacking the provincial government in Ontario, the provincial conservative government in Ontario, maybe that's
Mhm.
another indication of. And you know what, Giovanni Polyev has been very kind of different since the election, and humbler, and doing mainstream
They
interviews and
all
all
are.
this stuff,
They all
right?
are.
But
They're all going
Giovanni,
on
yeah,
CBC with a
going on the
smile. Right.
CBC, which they wouldn't do for 5 weeks during the election campaign.
Right.
CBC was the enemy, defund the CBC, right? We heard like that
Yep.
kind of crap. The Trudeau government has propped up all these,
Yep.
mainstream media. But Giovanni's rant to me, and again, he did it on the CBC, so we went on the CBC. To me, was
Right.
sanctioned by Polyev. I think he talked to Polyev before he did that. And to me, that's a shift of even Ontario. Polyev and Giovanni are from Ontario, a shift of their mindset towards Western Canada. So we'll
Yeah.
see. But
Well,
that was very important to me, that rant he went on.
yeah. Well, and what was important to me the next day is he was, like I said, he was on CBC with a smile, almost acting like he wasn't. He had concerns, but that it wasn't a rant. It was like he wasn't
Yeah.
totally putting the shit back in the horse, but he was at a point where he's like, "Oh, I came off a little bit rough in that one. Let me be a little bit diplomatic, but still an asshole at the
I
same
only
time."
blame Doug Ford, our provincial leader, for handing the election to the Liberals on national
Right.
television, right? I only did
Right.
that,
Yeah.
but I didn't
Yeah.
really mean it.
Right. But the NDP are in trouble. The question, because, and you mentioned this, it depends on if the NDP are a dead party, and as I was going to say, in a bad way, the world is their oyster because they can rebuild anywhere. They need to determine where their base is going to be. Do you go BC? Okay, where you've had a base for a long time. Do you go Quebec, where you built a base in 2011 and then it just crashed and burned? Do you go to Ontario because it's Ontario, right? I mean, they're really at a point where they need to determine a few things. One, where are they going to be based? Two, are they just going to constantly be the protest vote? And this is why I've been hearing a lot with Canadian media is that in order for the NDP to really be anything again, they really need to get back to being, well, they need, Jack Layton basically shifted the party in a way saying, hey, we can be a governing party. And then once he died, Tom Mulcair went in there. Mulcair did okay, but ever since Jagmeet Singh, it's always vote for us if you don't like these two, instead of just vote for us. And so the NDP needs to determine if they really want to be a ruling party or not. And then they have to determine the ideological direction they want to go. Are they going to go totally identity politics left, left on foreign policy and all that? Or are they going to go more to the center? And I think this is the reason why you see somebody like Tom Mulcair being very critical, because Mulcair and to a certain extent Jack Layton was the centralization of the party. And then and even if Jagmeet Singh is dinged with it or unfairly or not, the party has seen more left under him. And this is going to but I will say one thing before we get totally I did want to make this point about, well, no, I'll come back to this point after we talk about Australia. But yeah, what do you think about the future of the NDP? I'm not sure they're going to survive. People say they'll come back, but it matters what they do over these next 6 months to determine if they come back. I think if they go far left, identity politics, Gaza, Gaza, Gaza all the time, they will be they're going to be a not an official status for a long time.
Yeah, at the federal level, right? We need to see what
Oh, at the
happens at the
federal level, yeah, because we're
provincial
talking. I
level.
mean, at the
But
provincial level, it's different, and
yeah,
they need to ask themselves, what are they doing at the provincial level? This is the same thing with the Liberals in Australia. Look at Queensland and other places; they have to ask what they're doing at the provincial level. NDP needs to ask what is Manitoba, British Columbia, and other places doing at the provincial level that's keeping them in power. I mean, even though she's not the premier anymore, one of the biggest upsets in recent political history was Rachel Notley's NDP
yeah,
winning in Alberta.
yeah. And I was excited to see her on television the other day.
Yeah,
She has a lot of insight into Alberta, obviously, and she's on gosh, I'm blanking on the name. John Charest on there also. The Prime Minister's Council on U.S. Canadian
right.
relations,
U.S. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, and Rachel Notley being in a specifically unique position, being from Alberta, but also being NDP, right? To discuss that. Where did the NDP go? Is it like the other Orange Party, the Orange Party in the UK? The Lib Dems vote collapsed in the 2015 election after they had gone into coalition with Labour. With
mhm,
the Conservatives, with David Cameron and
right.
George Osborne's Conservatives. Now, this feels kind of similar because I think part of the backlash against Jagmeet Singh was, we could have been rid of Trudeau earlier if
Mhm.
you hadn't kept propping up the Trudeau government. And I am hearing some analysis after the election of Singh falling on his sword and saying, hey, this guy prevented us from having a conservative government, so we should thank him. I get some of that. I feel some of that, actually.
I think that's actually what it is, because I don't say, okay, Jagmeet Singh goes ahead and, let's say 8 months ago, before Donald Trump was elected, goes ahead and says that. No, we'd have a majority conservative. If the
Yeah.
conservatives did as well in this election, and
Yeah, they
we're
would have won.
expected,
They would have won.
yeah, Carney to have a majority of, let's say, 185, the conservatives would have won that easily. And now could it have saved the
And there
NDP a
wouldn't have
little
been
bit?
time
Yes.
for the Liberals to change party leader.
No,
Trudeau would have been
no.
their leader in that election, lame duck,
Yeah.
like Stephen Harper
Yes,
was in
exactly.
2015, right?
Yep. Yep.
Like Paul Martin was in whichever election it was, 2006. I mean, they
Hmm.
knew he was a problem. There was a scandal. There was a huge scandal, but they didn't have
Right.
time once the no confidence vote triggered an election in 2006 to remove him. So it would have been the
Right.
same thing in 2024. There would have been no time to remove Trudeau. And
Right.
so Singh did save the Liberal government. And there's some people thanking him. But where does the NDP go from here? I look at the Lib Dems who floundered around. They were kind of this centrist party before 2015. Now they've, I think, tried to redefine themselves as a Europhile left-wing party to a large extent. They're to the left of Labour
Hmm.
now. Does the NDP reposition itself as a party that's forget Gaza, all this? We're going to try and get the working class whites back. This populist left
Right.
wing populist party. Um, I mean, perhaps all the Gaza protesters are now in the although actually, funny thing is of the federal candidates, federal leaders, um, the most outspoken about Palestine was and Gaza was Blanchet, because the bloc sees the obvious
Right.
similarity, right? The obvious and analogous nature of their situation with the situation of the Palestinians. Um,
Right.
this is the same reason why I know. I was just reading yesterday diplomatic history of the separation of East Bengal from Pakistan, and when Indian diplomats went to Ottawa, they got the coldest reception, basically because, hey, and this was in the 1970s. It was the Trudeau government. We have this problem with Quebec, so there is no way we're acknowledging a breakaway of Pakistan or anywhere. We're
Right.
not, we'll back you on Kashmir, basically, because we don't want any breakaways anywhere. So I don't know where the NDP repositions itself. Does it become a populist left wing party? Does it become a party which gets trusted in terms of provincial government because they are more focused on the mechanisms of government
Hmm.
than the liberals or the conservatives who are into performative politics? Now, does that change at the federal level now that you have Carney, who is a technocrat, versus a performer in Trudeau?
Right.
That's all Trudeau was. He was a
Oh yeah, yeah,
performer. He
absolutely,
was playing a
absolutely not.
role.
Absolutely.
I mean, he wasn't a serious governing. I mean, I may be offending a lot of people here by saying this. I hope people aren't
No,
clicking off our podcast and
it's
unsubscribing. But that's
no,
how I would describe him.
it's
No different than Trump. A Trump of the
yeah.
center left. That's how I describe Macron in France, which is why I know we're going to get into the UK in a little bit. But I think this is why there's kind of Carney fever spreading through the chattering classes in Britain, because they
Mhm.
feel like, and I'm hearing this from the British media specifically, not from the Canadian media, Mark Carney might show us the way to beat populism. You put a technocrat in, you put a
Right.
bureaucrat in, you put a smart, competent person in. That's a governing question, right? That's not ultimately a political question. But the British
Right.
media is beginning to think it's a political question. Maybe that's what you need. You need a serious, competent person with a very dry sense of humor or no sense of humor. Um,
Right.
that and maybe that is what took the NDP vote that went to them in Western Canada. Is he's really
Well,
competent, so we're going to
I
back
have
him.
heard. Well, I have heard, and I want to get back to NDP, but I just want to mention this Carney real quick. I have heard that a lot of people maybe think that one of the reasons he did well, and remember, he has a minority government. And I want to keep on hammering this point home because everyone's acting like it's a huge win. He was expected to win at least 15 more seats and didn't. To me, that's huge. But a lot of times in the debates is like he never took the bait. He like if someone went after him, he did it in a very calm way, and I think that benefited him. But as far as getting back to the NDP, looking at the members who have been reelected, I see Don Davies as the only one who can, out of that group of those who have been elected, to be able to carry on. Now, you don't have official party status. So, therefore, the question I have is if you don't have official party status, how important is it, and especially in the day of social media, how important is it for your member of your party leader to actually be a
It's
member of
not. It's
parliament?
not. I was about to make that same point, Dave. It's not, because
Right,
they don't have official party status. They don't have the resources and the staffing that comes
right,
with official party status now. For those who
right.
don't understand this designation, you lose your staffing, you lose a lot of the resources. So I think you pick a leader at large from the members.
But you don't lose the media because here's the thing: at the end of the day, the CBC and others, they're still going to bring an NDP person on. Okay,
That's
if you
true.
if you're going to have a panel on the CBC, you're always going to have an NDP person in there. So the question I have is, do you go for someone like Rachel Notley?
Yeah.
Okay, you don't have a party, you don't have official party status. No worry about having someone who's a member of parliament be there. Look for someone who has won in places where you shouldn't win, and has run and is moderate,
Yeah, because Don Davies'
comparable
vote
to
collapsed too, right? He almost didn't make it.
right.
Um, and yeah, he's the one that
But he
survived in
also
Vancouver.
won.
But
But he also won in a place they expect to win,
the place
and
that they
it's
always
like
win.
Rachel.
I mean, the,
Right.
the
So it's like
liberals are never a factor in That's the thing that's confusing. Maybe we're bashing the Liberals too much. They did really well in BC. That I didn't expect. Even
They
the
go up
morning
and
after the
down.
election, I was surprised when I looked at BC.
I think in
Honestly, in spite of the
2015.
polls, I was surprised about BC.
Well, I think in 2015 the conservative or the liberals actually won the majority of popular vote
Oh,
in
did they in
BC.
BC in
Yeah,
20?
I think
Yeah,
so. If not, they
that
were
was
very
just kind of a
close.
reaction election
And
to
yeah,
Harper, the
but
end of Harper.
I'm saying right now, Rachel Notley, I think would be the best person to do two things. One, she comes from a place they have that they don't traditionally win, or they don't win federally, except for Edmonton, Strathcona. Okay, and that could be the riding that she, if they want to put her in. I say don't worry about putting her in. Um, if they want to, they can make Edmonton, Strathcona the one, because in the Parliament, Edmonton, Strathcona in the Alberta Parliament was her riding. Okay, so that could just be a switch. The second thing is she knows how to speak. The third thing is she, if anyone, even though she did stuff at the end of the campaign, shows a clear split or a clear separation from Jagmeet Singh. It shows a rebirth of the party that is totally different than what the party is now. So I truly believe that this is where they need to go. Rachel Notley, if they had official party status, that would be different. They don't. I think Rachel Notley is the best choice.
Okay, so
Um,
I have two. Maybe Heather McPherson still could be the leader, right? And she's sitting in Parliament. But I have two, two kind of shouts. I think Charlie Angus being kind of the journalist, the
I think
writer.
he's doing something else now.
Okay,
I think like he's on Substack. He's making money on Substack. He's doing that. He's writing books. I got his book right here. He's writing books. I think he's done what. I mean, that's just my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I just think he's done with Parliament.
and I still think Peter Julian can be your kind of at
Yeah.
large. He lost his riding. I acknowledge that he lost the other day, but he's a
Right.
guy that I think is still kind of brilliant in the way he can articulate NDP positions. So now being in the
Right.
public, I'm not saying get him back into Parliament. I'm saying maybe he can be
Right.
your party leader on the outside.
Right. I mean, there are a number of
And I
people
think Heather
from
McPherson may be still, her or Don Davies, if you're going to go in Parliament. I mean, those are really the only two left, right? I mean, who else won?
right.
They have seven. I
I mean,
need
they
to check
don't.
who the
They
others.
don't.
Jenny
Yeah, they
Kwan, she
don't.
won. Jenny Kwan's still
She
around.
won. She
Yeah,
won. So I mean, she could be
it could be her.
one
Yeah.
as well. But it's kind of like I'm trying to think of other people from kind
This
of the
happened again. I
past.
mentioned the Lib Dem example. This happened after everybody had lost, including Charles Kennedy, who unfortunately passed away a week or two after that
Right.
election. They went back to Vince Cable as their leader. And while they didn't pick up tremendously more seats in the next election, they did get a bunch of party switchers, actually, pro-European
Hmm.
Tories that became Lib Dems. And then that kind of got them into a position where they rebuilt. And they're now, I mean, in fact, I
Well,
think
I
the
mean,
Lib Dems' best election ever may have been the last election last year, where the two-party system kind of broke down into like a five-party system.
well, back to the NDP. I mean, I'm looking at people. I'm looking at the 2011 election, and you have people. You have Jack Harris. You have Robert
Mm.
Chisholm. You have Megan Leslie. You have Peter Stauffer. I mean, you have some big names in there. I'm
Peter
going to go.
Stauffer, that's a good
But
one.
I mean, he just might be out of everything now. You have I'm trying to look at some of the other ones. Yep, Paul Dewar, who is big and I think he left because he retired. I don't think no, he actually did lose his seat in Ottawa Center to the Liberals. So Paul Dewar would be, but to me, Rachel Notley, clear break. You're talking about someone from Alberta. You're talking about somebody who will not be afraid to tell the extreme left of your party, no, you're not always right. And that's what I think they need to do. And if they go that extreme left route, they're going to lose. They're going to constantly. I think Rachel Notley should be the leader of the party. Pure and
Yeah,
simple. That's
I
just
mean,
my point.
and any thoughts about maybe Laurel Collins? If we're, she obviously lost the other day, but she's
Mm-hmm.
another one that I thought was kind of a rising star in the party. It's hard in BC. Something happened in BC that we have to put our fingers on. So Jenny Kwan,
Well, right.
even though Jenny Kwan and Don Davies won, they underperformed, and
If
obviously she
here's the
lost. Singh
thing.
lost.
Here's the thing about Rachel Notley. If she became the NDP leader tomorrow, a large segment of Canadian voters would know who she is.
Mm.
Just by virtue of her that I
Provincial
mean
leadership, yeah.
that 2015 election really did catapult her status. And she also has the credentials of I fought against Danielle Smith.
Yeah.
I fought
I fought
against
the Wild Rose Party and
yeah,
every
I
other
fought them.
separatist party in Alberta because it was funny. One of these UK
Right.
conversations, Danielle Smith came up, and the UK media knows a lot more about Canadian politics than the US media. I shouldn't have made the false
Oh yeah.
equivalency at the beginning of the podcast. Big mistake.
No, you're right.
But one of the panelists said in the UK, "Oh, Wild Rose Party and every other separatist party in Alberta," because that British person knew like they're all these,
Right.
But Rachel
And
Notley is the one that kind of broke those parties, quite frankly.
right. And the question is, could someone like Rachel Notley give you that Windsor West, Hamilton Center, London Fanshawe? Can she give you those back? Could she help you in Toronto Danforth or some other places? That to me, she's the logical choice, especially since you don't have official party status. Now let's go ahead and go to the UK really quickly. This is more your wheelhouse than mine. So we had the Runcorn in Helsby. It just sounds like a name of a pub to me. I guess that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
The by-election and Reform
Runcorn, but
winning.
yeah. Runcorn,
Okay.
that's fine.
Runcorn. It's like, yeah. So you had Reform win that. But the party that lost the most was Labor. And the question I have is, you can answer this or your thoughts on it. Did Labor lose more of a percentage compared to the Conservatives simply because they're the governing party now? And on top of that, how much can we actually glean from by-elections being a predictor of anything in the future, especially now that we're in a situation of majority government in Britain, and we're not going to have an election for a while.
Yeah, and the by-elections. Speaking of the Lib Dems, they specialize in winning these by-elections in between elections, and then you get to the general election, and they those
Florida Democrats.
Well, yeah,
actually to a certain extent
they
do
would
that
lose,
as well. Yeah,
they would lose, but I think there's a broader thing because if you look at the council elections, Reform did really well. So in Runcorn, by the way, the Mercy Gateway, the new bridge over the Mercy River. It was built right there, so I kind of know the area. I was following that area for a while. Very Labor area, but it's a traditional red wall area, which the working class folks they're skipping. So they're skipping the halfway house of the Conservatives, right? They're going from Labor to Reform.
Then this comes at a point of, can you look at the traditional left-right spectrum?
No, you can't.
When it comes to that, if you're Labor, if you're
same thing we're talking about,
right? And same thing with with America.
US,
it's just you only got one, But it's kind of like, I'm working class. I'm coming down the road. I see Labor isn't doing anything for the working class. Do I go to Reform, who talk about them, or do I go to Conservatives, who I think are the stuffy guys whose names who have the monocle
and wanted to fire me? So this is exactly the U.S. You say it's only two, but actually no, because they were never going to vote for Mitt Romney. Those people, they were never going to vote for John McCain. They gladly voted for Obama. Over that. It was just, okay, once you get someone who's talking your language, who's not that guy, even though Trump has probably fired more people than Romney has. Romney's created far more jobs than Trump has.
Right.
But that doesn't matter, right, to these people. I don't, they're not thinking logically. But, so they're going to Reform. This is a warning sign for Labor. But what was even worse, I think, was the Conservatives who just got wiped out in the council elections by Reform. I mean, there was almost like a direct one-to-one switch, it seemed, in so many places. Kemi Badenoch as the party leader is an ineffective communicator. This is, again, the problem with having to have a party leader that's an MP. If you had the rules like you did in Canada, they could pick someone at large because they're reduced to I mean, it's almost like a rump conservative party now with their 100 seats or whatever they have, 120 seats. They don't
Yeah.
have. They have some people like James Cleverly who are still kind of impressive, but they don't have. I mean, all of the MPs that they had that could have mounted a challenge, are out of Parliament. So you've got a situation where. Um, uh, they are not any longer seen as the credible alternative to Labor. And if you look at the national vote share in these council elections, Reform was first with 30. Labor uh, uh, was at 20%. Third
Mhm.
were the Lib Dems at 17%. So you have to assume if there's a threat of a conservative government based on what's happened in the past or a reform government, just like we saw in Canada. I hate to jump ahead 4 years. I think a
No.
lot of those Liberal Dem votes go back to Labor. Okay, so
Right.
so if you combine those two, it's 37%. Let's say 10% stays with the Lib Dems. So then it's still Labor is competitive with Reform. 15% for the Tories. 15%
Yeah.
nationally in terms of like vote share in these
Well,
council elections, and then 11% for the Greens. A lot of that vote will return to Labor in a national election, in a general election. But
and
the
I
conservative vote
mean,
has collapsed.
I'm not the most, like I said, I'm not.
But
I'll
let
admit,
me
I'm
ask you
the.
this before you
Well,
you say what you're about to say. Does this
mhm.
remind you of Canada in the 90s with the PCs collapsing the way the Tories are collapsing now?
No, because this is just an overall shift.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas the PC collapse was purely because I just want to say it just seems like you have one party coming up and one party coming down, like naturally. Whereas when we look at Canada, there was the constitutional crises that happened during this time, which I think totally jarred everything. Okay, because remember, everyone thinks about the West and the collapse that happened because of reform. As I mentioned before, a ton of their seats
We're in Quebec.
were in Quebec.
And they've
Okay,
never
and I
gotten
think a
them
lot of
back. They've
people,
really never gotten them back,
right?
even in the
No,
Harper
and
elections.
right,
Um,
right. Harper ones would have been the
oh,
closest
so let
one,
me point out
but
before
see,
we get back to the UK, I do need to point out for listeners who don't know this or viewers, there is a different constitutional process now for separation post 1995 Quebec
mhm.
referendum that
Stefan
Alberta would
Dion was
have
the
to,
one.
yeah, Alberta would have to follow if they do this. Um,
Right.
and that includes First Nations, who seem very opposed to
Yeah.
separation or
Yeah.
secession,
Yeah.
whatever we want to call it, however, we're
And that is
sovereignty, separation.
and that is something too, which I'll talk about in a second. But looking at the council races, uh, I'm looking at Kent, okay, and I see in Kent that you had, let's see, you have Reform at 57, Liberal Democrats 12, Conservatives 5. Now, to me, whenever I think of Kent, I think of traditional Tory
Tory
blue,
heartland.
and if it does move, it's going to go Lib Dem. It's not going to
Yes.
go Labor. It's going to
Yeah.
go
It's not
Lib
going to
Dem.
go labor. Labor's never been
Right.
competitive there. I had
Exactly.
family that lived there, so I know that. They would end up voting
And
Lib Dem because they couldn't vote
right.
labor there.
So I'm looking at Kent, and I'm like, it's more than just workers. It's more than just labor grievances. That's that's pushing reform, because you're talking about them out of 81 seats, Reform UK now having 57 in Kent. That shows and the conservatives being okay. Conservatives have 5 seats.
What did they have
Green
before?
Party has 5 seats.
What did they have before conservatives in Kent?
I don't know. I'm trying to.
They probably had a
I've been.
majority. I'm sure they controlled it.
I'm sure they had a majority. I for some reason I can't find
And
the
you're right. In
election.
those places, the wealthier places in the South, Lib Dems provided the main competition, which is why, as I said, I had family that lived in Kent that they wanted Labor to win the general election, but they voted Lib Dem because they knew that was the only way
They
to stop
have
conservatives.
so I guess they had joint leaders back between 1993 and 1997, which was the last time you really saw the Conservative Party started to do their collapse.
Yeah.
So but they were in a power sharing agreement, it looks like, with the Lib Dems. But yeah, to me, if reform's taking over in places where the conservatives are like the bedrock, then let me ask you this. Are we going back to Canada now, are we looking at a merger of the parties? Are we looking at reform essentially eating up the conservatives and reform just becomes conservative? Or what do you think? And so are
It's a
we at that
possible there's
position
a
yet?
merger, or the Conservatives, the oldest major political party in the. And it's funny, we're talking. I mean, the Liberals have won the election in Canada. We have to remember that. But we're talking about the
Mhm.
two most successful parties in Western democracies having
Mhm.
problems now: the Liberal Party in Canada and the Conservative Party in the UK. And I think the Tory Party is about to collapse. I honestly think uh, they unleashed a monster in Brexit that they can't, in terms of the type of populist sentiment. And you know what,
Right.
very much uh, will go down to Boris Johnson and those sorts of people. And I think a lot of the old traditional high Tories uh, that I see, even when they're on television, they seem to be talking up the Lib Dems and talking up Labor. They really don't want to talk up their own party. They'll always
Right.
preface that I am, I have confidence in Kemi Badenoch, or before that, Rishi Sunak, but they're not. I think they kind of like Sunak, but they would say, "Oh,
Right.
I have confidence in Liz Truss." We know they didn't. Um, but it's a party with a leadership crisis. It's a party without an identity. It's a party that lost its actual base. Its base is in
Right.
places like Kent, in places like Sussex, in the South. Um,
Right.
they lost their actual base by engaging in this populist fervor. They further unleashed the populist fervor. This is the danger for Polyev. Now, maybe
Right.
he crushed out Bernier and the People's Party, but you look at the UK example, where Boris Johnson's rhetoric then began to match the rhetoric of the far right populists and the little
Mhm.
English nationalists. Which also, by the way, this is going to cause a huge backlash in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Don't think reform is going to have any support in Scotland. They're not, right. So
No.
the separatism we're talking about with Quebec, it's going to come right back in Scotland.
Right.
If reform forms the next UK government, there will be a referendum for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom, and I think it probably would pass. Honestly,
Yeah, it
if
could.
Farage is the PM. So,
I'm
uh,
kind of surprised it hasn't happened already. I
well,
mean,
it's
not
good.
with
Yeah,
yeah.
it will. I mean, I think they're a little more
The
comfortable with
Scottish
the Labour
National
government.
Party had their
Yeah, they
own
had their own
problems they had to deal
internal.
with. Yeah.
Yeah, but
But I
so
want to
but
Oh, go
just
ahead.
finishing up on this, I think they're collapsing to the point where those high Tories and those kind of traditional Tories, maybe the party of Middle England, so to speak, becomes the Lib Dems. So then you're looking at Labor with this kind of urbane, elite, technocratic, Mark Carney style people are Labor. The Lib Dems kind
Right.
of move from, they were all over the place, but they replace conservatives in that sense. And then you've got this hard right party.
Right.
No, this is kind of ironic because we're talking about this being the first federal election in Canada where the two biggest parties accounted for over 80% of the vote. Right now in
Right.
the UK, that we had that phenomenon in 2017 for the first time in a while, 82% between Labor and the
Right.
Conservatives. Now those are the two parties collapsing, or the two main
Right.
parties.
Well, and I
And I
think
think Labor
too.
survives. Labor will survive,
Well,
whereas
oh
I'm
yeah,
not sure the
yeah.
Tories survive, honestly.
Well, and you know what? This goes back to, somebody like this right here, Tim Miller.
Oh God, yeah.
And what it goes back to is there needs with Trump, Polyev, whatever's going on with the conservatives in the UK, the Liberal Party in Australia, which we're going to talk about in a second, the Republicans in France, traditional conservatism based on business wealth is collapsing. Elitist conservative ideas, the William F. Buckleys and stuff, that whole entire system is collapsing. And people like Tim Miller and all them, well, maybe not Tim Miller, there seems to be a shift there. But a lot of these never Trumpers have to realize your ideas are not popular anywhere anymore. So you talk about Mitt Romney. Perfect point. Where do you think Mitt Romney can fit in right now? I don't even know if Mitt Romney could win an election in Utah anymore. Okay,
Wow.
and there, I mean, tell me a place, maybe Germany, maybe Germany. Tell me a place where traditional conservative, pro business, center right on social issues, conservative parties are who have been mainstream
Like
for
France.
the part.
Think about France. It
They're
started in
all
France.
gone,
It started in
right?
France. They were gone in 2015. The Hollande election, Sarkozy got into trouble,
Right,
but after that they were gone. U.S. they're gone. We talked about
right.
that. Canada. I mean, the PCs are still controlling Ontario, but that
Okay, but I'm talking about, I guess, at the federal level.
they're gone.
So,
They're gone.
right, right, yeah,
UK, they're gone. We're talking about that.
right.
Do
Okay,
the Lib
if you
Dems
want to go to
replace them?
Northern
Do the Lib
Ireland,
Dems become that party? But maybe there isn't a constituency for that anymore, is what you're
I mean,
saying.
if you go, I mean, maybe in Ireland, but Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are kind of the same. I hate to say it,
Yeah.
but if you look at Northern Ireland, Ulster Unionists collapsed to the DUP. But in all these other countries, you're just seeing that traditional conservatism just go away, and there are, and but
And the
what
DUP
pisses,
are just,
but
the
what
DU.
piss,
This was part of the issue with the Conservatives in the UK by going into a supply and confidence agreement with the DUP. This is why Carney needs to be careful about his choice of partners now in Canada.
right,
That pushed the Tory party into places where Theresa May didn't want to be, even though it was only the
right.
8 Ulster Unionists or 10, whatever
Oh yeah,
they needed. It pushed them into a place where the government would collapse if they didn't placate them on certain, not just on unionist issues with Northern Ireland, but on culturally social issues where I think the mainstream of the Tory party was uncomfortable. And really,
but
the party's kind of broken up since, or is in the verge of
but I
breakup.
do but I do think one of the problems is, and this is where I'm going to go to David from. There are people who are still part of that who are basically, I think, speaking into a void because their ideas are no longer accepted anywhere. And a lot of the people in the media who represent the conservative point of view are still holdovers from what we had during the Thatcher, Reagan, or if you want to get more recent, you know, someone like Bush or Cameron, Stephen Harper era. You have a lot of those people in the media who don't like what's happening to their conservative parties and movements, but are totally not in touch with the reality of what politics is today. So you have somebody like David Frum, who just fundamentally does not understand that the Canadian conservatives are not going back to Brian Mulroney. Okay, they're not going back to maybe Stephen Harper. They would, but they're not going back into that direction. You got a lot of people in Britain realize they're not going back to. I mean, I thought Margaret Thatcher was bad, all right. They're not going back to John Major.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, they're not going back
They're not
to
going back
a
to
lot
David
of.
Cameron.
They're not going back to
They're the
David
more recent
Cameron, right?
example. They're not. That's
Right.
done.
They're not going. France is not going back to
Sarkozy.
Jacques Chirac. I would say more,
Okay. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, Sarkozy as well. Okay, and you do not. The only place that I can see that you see this is Germany. You could go back to a Merkel.
Yeah.
Okay, but in all these other
But
countries,
but
and
but but in 5 years, maybe in Germany, we're having the same conversation. Since the election, the AfD, their numbers continue
mhm,
to go up. It's kind of alarming, and the
right,
CDU's numbers have already gone down.
and to make the shift into the last election, I don't think you're going to see a John. Well, maybe there can be a change. I don't know if you'll see another John Howard in Australia anymore because Peter Dutton lost his seat. The Liberals in which, remember, for the listeners who don't know as much about Australian politics, the Liberals are the right wing party. Labor is the Labor Party, and by the way, they do spell Labor without a U in
Yeah, I spelled the
Australia. So
American
I
way.
always right. I love pointing that out. But as I mentioned in the American media, they're talking about how Mark Carney's win was this huge win, which I don't think it was. The win that we see in Australia is a huge, huge win. And if you actually look at the point in which the polls started to change, and Peter Dutton in the two party preferred was up by a few percent, that changed like literally the day that Trump announced that they were going to put tariffs on steel and aluminum. So that
Yeah.
started it. But for those people, and so I'm kind of laying it out that people might say, it was about Trump. Not really. So the liberals had a total collapse in the campaign. So, for example, Peter Dutton talked about how he would be fine with having a nuclear power plant in his neighborhood. That didn't go over well. He talked about the labor introduced a tax cut, and he said that he was against that tax cut. So, a liberal member being opposed to a tax cut is just not normal. You have another position where they talk about affordable housing. He had his kids there, and basically, the son said, and his son, I think, is in his early 20s, mid 20s, maybe, said he can't afford a house. And the reporters ask him, well, daddy, the dad who's running, would you help him pay for a house? And he said, yes. And everyone's like, well, we don't have the parents who are members of parliament who could, or leaders of the opposition who could just pay for our house. Um, and then there are other things that he would be for and then against. So people are going to look into this as being a Trump thing, which Trump did have an impact on it, but it was just a complete shit show for the Liberal Party. They imploded. This was probably the worst campaign
And
performance
they're
as
a
far.
party since John Howard that has had all of these leadership struggles, right? That they've even
Right.
had sitting prime ministers taken out within their party.
Mhm.
So it feels
Right.
like this is, and Malcolm Turnbull is kind of a troublemaker, right? So
Right.
you blame
He's
him
the
for that.
exception. He's the exception. He's one of those ones that I think knows what's going on. He was always the moderate one,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he was
yeah.
fine. But like, I mean, to those people who know Australian politics, this reminded me of 1993 and John Hewson's Fight Back, which was a horrible rollout. And for those of you who want, okay, and before we continue with Australia, for those of you who want to know more about Australian and Canadian politics, there's a series on the Canadian Film Board called The Champions, and it's about the struggle between René Levesque and Pierre Trudeau. I highly recommend watching that, as well as The Breaking Point, which is about the 1995 referendum. If you go on YouTube, there is a series called Liberals in Power, is about the Liberal Party of Australia. And then I think they also have one called Labor in Power, and it's about the Labor Party. It's like a 6 or 7 part series. Really, really good.
Bob Hawke era, what era?
It starts with Menzies.
Oh, okay,
And then it goes through Gough Whitlam and all that. And then yes, it goes through Bob Hawke. It ends as it ends after 1993. So it
okay.
ends after it actually ends as John Hewson was the leader, and then Paul Keating beat him. And the same thing with, I think, Liberals in Power. I think it ends with John Howard. Because remember, a lot of people who follow American politics, but like passively follow Australian politics, might not realize that John Howard was very much involved with the party in the early 80s. And we think of him more in the 90s and stuff as the leader. He was involved in the early
He
80s.
is
He
kind
had
of
been
their
considered.
Menzies. He was kind of the Liberal Party's Menzies, if
Well, Menzies was a Liberal Party guy. I
yeah,
mean,
he was kind of their
but like
Menzies of
Menzies
that
was
era.
like,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
yeah, but he was always, but he wasn't like elected. He was never like he'd pop up as leader and then be gone. Right.
Yeah,
So and then
but he had
eventually
the
maybe
longevity in terms of that era that Menzies had in the
he
previous
might have
era.
been right. He might have been more like a Ronald Reagan,
Okay, yeah,
who started in the 60s and then didn't become something until 1980. I mean, became governor of California, obviously, but he made runs for the presidency, but it was like 1980 where it finally happen. But yeah, I mean, we've seen a collapse. Anthony Albanese, his campaign was flawless. And right now they're on 85 seats. They're still leading in like 9, which means that they could have a huge majority. Now, I do want to bring this kind of to the
they could have over
overall.
90 seats. I
Yeah.
didn't realize it was that big. I mean, I
Yeah.
knew there were
I
the
mean,
80s.
and Peter Dutton lost his seat.
Well, that I know.
And so it's,
So they
yeah.
could be
So,
in
I
the
mean, we're talking about,
90s.
They could
Holy
be in the
smokes!
90s.
So this could take
Yeah.
several elections to undo for the liberals.
That's what everyone's saying. And right now they're talking about the where the liberals are going to go, and they're kind of taking the opposite approach of Canada, but I guess so because you have this increase. It's the first time that an incumbent uh, prime minister has won since John Howard, and I think it's like the best result that they've had since Ben Chifley, but it might even be the best result they've ever had.
So if they're in
It's a
the
better result than Bob
90s,
Hawke had
so if
ever
they're
had.
in the 90s, I'm trying to do the math in my head. Uh,
They
they
can
would
get
have a
around
super.
63%.
They would have a super
Very, yeah,
majority
yeah. Um,
if they get the 90.
so, yeah, so I think, I mean, so this was big. Now I'm going to say one thing. I'm writing about it right now. So I'll have the article out on Voting Trend. There are two things that I want to talk about as far as all these the Canadian and the Australian elections. There are two things that I think the Democrats in the United States could learn. The first one is have have a message of positivity looking forward. Always have your message looking forward, because when Kamala Harris and Tim Walz became the candidates, they were just talking about, it was kind of like Bill Clinton's "Don't stop thinking about tomorrow and hope and
Yeah.
change for the future." That's what happened when the Kamala Harris campaign changed, was when all of a sudden Trump started talking about them eating dogs. They're eating dogs. Then it was just kind of like, let him hang himself. And they just kind of forgot their own campaign. Whereas Mark Carney to a certain extent, but Anthony Albanese definitely kept on going. Another thing, and this is going to be controversial, and like you said, maybe people unsubscribe, I don't know. I didn't hear the words marginalized communities, LGBTQ, trans, this, that, and the other. I heard no identity politics in any of the debates, in any of them. And the Democrats have been beholden to identity politics to such an extreme that the Democratic Party is kind of the outlier in the world. But it was so nice to hear debates be about economic policy, foreign policy, things like this. But they weren't talking, with the exception of Aboriginal rights. But and it's important to know, Aboriginal rights isn't, it's a civil rights issue, but it's also a land rights issue. It's also a governing issue, okay? Because you're talking about people who do have their own lands. But like, what are your thoughts of like what happened in Australia and what which they're still counting. There's still like 16 seats that haven't been decided yet because they have the two party preferred.
Yeah.
So in a lot of these places, they usually assume, all right, we already know that these two are going to be the top, so then we can start counting the two party preferred. Since we know these two are going to be the top, some of them they don't know who the top two are going to be yet, so they don't start counting the two party preferred until they definitely know who the top two are in the primary vote. So that's the reason why we still have about 15 or 16 out, because they're still determining who those top two are going to be before they go. But if they already kind of have a guess, hey, this is going to be Labor versus the coalition, we can go ahead and just start counting primary votes. And then if they actually do that and there's a surprise, then they have to kind of go back and recount. So that's the reason why I personally think Australia has the best system. That's my opinion. You can pick. I mean, it's not too far off from what France does, except France just kind of does it a week later.
Yeah, I'm not sure I
But
like
yo,
the chief exec. I don't like the strength of the French president. I think that they have too many
well,
problems.
I'm talking about more of the
The parliamentary.
elections
Okay, yeah, yeah,
instead
yeah.
of
And they do it.
the
They
election
do the
instead
two
of the
party prefer.
government.
Yeah, the next week.
Right,
Right,
right.
right.
Yeah. So, like, what is your thought about all of this? I
Well,
mean, you
first
can
of all,
talk
I
about
think you're right
Australia if you want.
about Australia. The two party preferred is much better than anything we have in Canada or the U.S. or the U.K. Now you've got in Canada, and you've had in Canada for years, and now you have it in the U.K. People getting elected as MPs with 30% of the vote in their ridings or their constituencies as
And
they're
this
called.
happens a lot in Quebec.
It
A
happens.
lot in
It
Quebec.
happens a lot in Quebec. You have people under 30% get in. You get 28,
Yeah, because you have
29%.
some where you have four. You have some where the
Yeah,
NDP is still alive and kicking. So you got
yeah.
the NDP, Bloc Québécois, Liberal, and Conservative. And then if you throw the Green Party in there, you never know.
Yeah, the identity politics stuff has to end. Um the focus on trans issues, all of that. The Democrats have put themselves in such a bad place with that, and the
Right.
arrogance, not understanding the lessons of why they were returned to power at first in the House in 2018 and then in the Senate
Mm-hmm.
and the presidency in 2020. Um, and they don't understand the lessons of why they were thrown out of power now
No.
in 2024. So I don't think the Democrats are going to do particularly well. I mean, the Republicans might have a lock on the Electoral College and on the presidency for the next 16 to 20 years. I don't see a
Right.
Democrat getting elected president again in my lifetime, quite frankly.
Well, I mean, and I want to make this
Now
clear
Congress
about,
is different. The House is
yeah,
different, but yeah,
but
this,
when it comes to let's say Carney and the Liberals, Albanese and Labor, it's not like they're against these issues. It's not
no,
like they took a different position. It's
they
it's
just
a
don't talk
matter
about it.
it's a matter of prioritization. Okay, like you might find, and I always say this. Let's say you ran on a platform of saying we want to give ice cream to everyone, and you do polling, and you find 95% of people like ice cream. It's not an issue that people are voting on. And so this is something that, I mean, there are all other aspects of it,
Well, I would
but they're
also point
not moving
out
away from
Carney.
these.
Carney is known even from his time as a banker as being a massive environmentalist, which we thought would be
Right,
an issue in Western Canada. And the Liberals didn't do any worse than they usually they did better generally than they usually do in Western
right,
Canada. Which also reminds me, the Democrats who've abandoned environmental issues to a large extent. They're into climate change, but they've abandoned some other core environmental issues, maybe because of pressure from minority groups who want jobs. I mean,
right,
maybe I shouldn't go down that rabbit hole, but that's part of my
right,
theory. Um, and pressure from unions. Um, it can
right.
work, right? It can absolutely work. Carney is known as a much more in tune with environmental considerations than Justin Trudeau was.
Oh
Didn't
yeah,
hurt him.
yeah.
Didn't hurt him at all. In a
And
country
one
that has as many polluters as the U.S. does, or as
and
percent.
one
Yeah, go ahead. Go
and
ahead.
well, when it comes to identity politics, remember a lot
Although,
of people
although
consider
I think this is also another reason why he did well. Before I forget, in Quebec, they know Carney's not going to build a pipeline through Quebec because of his
right,
environmental credentials. That's a
right,
big
right.
issue for Quebec sovereigntists. They don't want the Western Canadians plowing oil through Quebec.
See, okay, so this is the funniest thing I think that there is that you have Mark Carney saying, I believe in the concept of liberalism.
Yeah,
I believe in the concept of consulting the provinces.
right.
Then you have the conservatives bitching about Western alienization. We want to be our own province, but yet they want to unilaterally have a pipeline that goes from Alberta all the way to Quebec
Yeah,
and just totally forget about the
they don't
federalization
care about
aspect
local
of
control.
all of
We've
that.
seen this in the U.S. We see this
Right.
with now
It's
we have
bullshit on the
total
right.
preemption. They talk about local government and being closer to the people in the 90s. Now you've got Ron DeSantis in the Florida legislature preempting every local law. There's no point in having local governments other than collecting the trash, right? You might as well
Right.
put the state legislature and the governor in charge of my local town because that's the way the conservatives in the United States behave. And that's the way they
Yeah.
behave in Canada. So I think that pipeline issue, another reason Carney did so well in Quebec, because
Yeah.
they think Carney will stand up to the West. Right? They weren't so
And
sure about Trudeau with that.
I think conservatives did not do as well. I think like the Trois Rivières seat and others, they were expecting to pick up at least one, two, maybe three more. They really didn't. So
They're seen as a
it ended
Western
up,
Canadian party connected to
yeah,
oil and gas interests. They're not going to do well in Quebec. Period.
no, no, that's just not. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, but overall, it was just nice to watch a debate and it actually be about issues that impact um, every Australian or every Canadian. Whereas I don't think we're getting into that in the United States. And I'm not saying, you know, the same thing can see another issue. Okay, so to be fair, another issue I didn't hear about as much, though both countries have an issue with it, is immigration. So, okay, so I mentioned the identity politics on the left. Let's talk about immigration on the right. It did come up a little bit, but it was by no means the focal point of the debate. Whereas it seems like nowadays, United States, everything's either identity politics and immigration. I mean, it's just like those are the only two things we can talk about. We can't talk about
Oh,
any
I have
other.
to say, the Trudeau government let per capita far more people into Canada than Biden or Obama or any Democratic president has let into the United States. I mean, Canada has an immigration problem, in my opinion. This now I'm going to sound like I'm more conservative. Canada, they've
Right,
let too many people into the country. Now, I have to admit, those people have been productive in terms
right,
of keeping Canada's economy. Canada has had economic stagnation under Trudeau. This is where I think
mhm,
Carney again is different as a banker with that
right,
background. But the immigrants have kept Canada at a higher plateau than they might be otherwise.
right,
But they have an immigration problem. It's a strain, and the immigrants are not. Canada's a huge country. They're not spreading out throughout Canada. They're concentrating themselves in the GTA. They're concentrating, or I. By the way, I'm told it now should be the GTHA.
why Hamilton or
Hamilton,
something?
yeah.
Really?
So that's
Okay.
I've been corrected now a few times. So let's just call it the
I
GTHA.
That
Maybe
sounds
you
like
don't want to do
Hamilton
that.
people wanting to. That
Yeah,
sounds like Hamilton people wanting to
yeah,
be.
no, because I'm told like that's an American thing to call it the GTA. It's the GTHA up here. I'm like, okay, so the GTHA or GTHMA. Let's Mississauga in there. Let's just throw every
Right,
town in there. And Vancouver, right? There's concentrations in those two places, and Calgary to a lesser extent. So they're
right.
all kind of converging in the same places, which is makes me wonder: is that part of the reason the Conservatives did so well in the areas outside,
Well, we
just outside
mentioned
of
that on
Toronto?
election night.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
mentioned that, and Abacus polling came out and
And
basically
those
said
immigrants
this
are the ones
is
voting for the conservatives, apparently, based on
right.
point four that you sent me
See,
the other
okay,
day.
and this is another problem I would say with American identity politics liberal. They see that somebody is not a white person and just automatically assumes, they got to be voting for the
Same
liberal
thing
or
in
the
the
NDP.
UK. I mean, I don't know how many people told me after the 2019 election, where Jeremy Corbyn trashed the Labour vote. Why, your people, and I don't identify as
Right,
American, right? I don't identify as Indian, but Brits told me,
right,
oh, left wing Brits, your people, Indians, Indian Brits voted Tory. They wouldn't even be in this country if it wasn't for Labour, right? The Tories never wanted all these immigrants, and they're in the country because of us. And why would they vote for Boris Johnson? Now, first of all, Jeremy Corbyn was your leader. Let's just keep that in mind.
right,
But secondly, it's just an assumption again. Labor let them in, so they should vote Labor. The Democrats let them in, so they should vote Democratic. Trudeau let them in, so they should vote Liberal. And it doesn't work that way. I don't know
well,
why people on the
okay.
left always think this.
I mean, and it's weird because when I think of the UK, actually, has Labor ever had a visitable minority as their party leader?
No, no, and not only that, not only have
The
the Tories had
conservatives now have two in a row.
two in a row. Not only have they had two in a row, but they've had many more cabinet members who were black or
Yes,
Indian. I mentioned
yes,
James
yes, yes.
Cleverly as maybe the best parliamentarian they have now. He's black.
Right,
Kwasi Kwarteng was the chancellor. He's black. They had Javid as important minister in the Theresa May government. He's Pakistani
right,
or Indian or whatever. Priti Patel, right? There are all these people. What's her
right.
name? Who's crazy? I think on the right. Suella Braverman. She's Indian. Like there are much more prominent
Oh
conservatives
yeah,
who are Indian or black in the
right.
UK. It
And
really
many
kind of
are
makes
in
it,
Canada as well. And I
and in
think
Canada.
that's and I think it's that case a lot of times in the United States as well. It's just maybe they're less of a percentage of the population here, so therefore you don't see the impact of it as far
Yeah,
as members of Congress or whatever. But I mean,
it's a,
Vivek Ramaswamy is about to become governor, Republican governor of Ohio. It looks like. So I mean, there
well,
there is your first Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Bobby Jindal.
yeah, there you go. And I think that yeah, there's just this misconception on the left that and this is the problem. If you look now, I am kind of getting on my soapbox here, and I'll admit that. You look at everything through race, you're missing the forest through the trees.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you look at everything through race, you're just gonna assume that, oh, he's not white, Anglo, okay, so therefore he's not Anglo-Saxon. I mean, I guess that don't even matter because many Catholics are
Hey,
now
come
that.
to think of it,
It's
I don't
just
even know
yeah,
that the labor has had someone of color prominent run for leadership. Now that you think about it, and now in this cabinet, the only person he has is David Lammy, who's black, who is the foreign
mm-hmm.
secretary. He's really impressive, but that's the only one Stammer has. And it's always been racist between. Not that I care. I don't care one way or another. I never really
Right,
thought about this until
exactly.
you mentioned it. That um, Andy Burnham, who's one of my favorite politicians in the world, who's now the mayor of Manchester. He was the
Mm-hmm.
one who ran against Corbyn, right? He's a white guy against another white guy. So that's labor. Whereas the Tories have always had these, going back, now 10 to 12 years, have always had these very prominent uh, uh, leaders of color. We mentioned Jamil Javani earlier, right? He's a big figure in the parliamentary conservative party, and so he's obviously black.
Right. Right. Well, and that's kind of what I'm looking at. Yeah, so Leslie Lewis, who ran last time, she's black. There's never been a everyone who's run for the Liberal Party has been white.
Yeah,
But every now and then you do. Well, then you get the split in the party vote. But I mean, that's it. I mean,
and
and
Giovanni was a liberal, and when he lived in the U.S.,
yeah, he was
when he befriended
when he was with when he was
JD
JD
Vance, he
Vance,
was a Democrat. When
and
he
I wouldn't be surprised if he could be someone in the future. They can switch over, honestly. I know he's very vocal and all that, but I see it's kind of like Luke Skywalker talking to Darth Vader and say, "I can
Well, I mean, he
see,
barely
you
held
know,
his riding this time. So,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
there's still in those urban ridings, it's always fraught with danger, which is
right,
the question, right? The question I posed at the beginning. Maybe there is a realignment going on. Maybe the liberals aren't
right,
in terrible shape. Maybe they're going to start just sweeping those places in the future. I
right,
think they have a better shot with a guy like Carney to do that than with Trudeau. They were
yeah."
never going to realign under Trudeau.
Well, and this brings up another problem that you have, I think, with the liberals and why Carney was brought in. That you just don't have much of a leadership bench
No.
after Trudeau. Okay, I mean the conservatives have the same problem. I mean, unless you're going to go back to it, I mean, there's a few people who are prominent, but unless you're going to go back to an Andrew Scheer, it's almost like Pierre Poilievre is the only option. Okay,
Yeah.
now in the case of the Liberals and in Australia, they have no choice. Peter Dutton, it's the worst defeat that they've had for maybe ever. It might be the
Yeah.
worst defeat they ever had. You have to get rid of him.
I
See the
didn't realize
caveat,
there were maybe at 90 seats the labor.
right? I
That's
mean,
I mean
this
that's
is
just
and so and again to people like the Dutton campaign, but even with the Dutton campaign, there is this dynamic, and I wrote about it a few weeks ago, that you have the conservatives. I don't think it's happening in the UK because you have reform, but you have the Conservative Party Canada and the Liberal Party. They basically have to say, well, we're stuck between the Trump people and the soft conservative, conservative leaning, right leaning voters. We have to placate kind of both of them. And it means that we will flip flop. It means that we might not be able to have a strong focus on a certain policy because, and this is what we're going to see definitely in Canada. In Canada, the conservatives with Polyev being the leader again, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to come up as being more compassionate, more, we're not as bad as you think, but yet we want to not alienate the Trump people. And
right.
I don't think that works. I think that just keeps the conservatives in a minority uh, uh, even if it's a minority liberal government, it keeps them out of government. They need to either, and Jason Kenney said it during the CBC election coverage. He said that the conservatives need to have their sister soldier moment where they say, hey, listen, you true North right wing conservatives, you have no place in our conservative party. That they need, and I don't, and how
And
does
by the
that
way,
work? I don't know, but
I
they
heard
have to do it.
our listeners may be able to help us on this. I understand True North was absorbed into another, even bigger right wing website thing. So they're building like a Breitbart, Daily Caller type network in Canada. Rebel News, of course, being the other big one,
Right,
right? Um, and that's the alternative media because the conservatives felt like with True North and with Rebel News, they were safe and Polyev could talk to them and Polyev
right,
demanded conformity. I go back to the point about Parliament that I made earlier. You don't even have them talking to CPAC. You don't even have them talking to the CTV or CBC.
right,
The MPs straight line into the party caucus meeting. Aaron O'Toole was the leader. Very different. They'd
right,
interact. They'd talk. Um, and so it's very similar to what we saw in the US. If they don't cut that out, they're not going to make it. They're never going to get
right.
uh, uh, the the uh, the the number of seats needed. They're not going to get a majority of the 338 seats needed again
Well,
to win.
and and here's the thing,
Or
they
sorry,
that alternative,
343.
right,
343. I keep saying
right,
338. It's
338,
343.
right, yeah. But
Yeah.
then you also have that point where they might not be able to control that because I think one of the things that hurt the conservatives in this election, especially since we're talking about it being okay closer than we think. Okay,
Right.
they didn't get the majority of the liberals, but how much did after that French debate? The only English questions being asked by those people, and then that being in the news cycle for a few days, how much did that hurt the conservatives? Because I think I'm I'm kind of surprised the liberals didn't pounce on that. It was like they just kind of let that run its natural course. But when everyone asking the questions, like from Rebel News and True North and all that, like every single question, I mean, it was so much of a problem they had to cancel the press conferences for the English debate, and it was like that left a bad taste in a lot of voters' mouths, I think. And and yes, it's kind of a two-way street. The conservatives need to do that, but if the conservatives are going to hold on to this, the liberals need to pounce on this. And I don't think. I mean, had Carney been more aggressive, I think they might have been in a majority. I don't think he was aggressive enough. I truly don't, and
Well,
that's
I
not
think they
his.
were looking at the polls and they wanted him to be very safe and they were scared about a gaffe. And
That could be true.
he's a newcomer to politics. I think his political instincts were
But
pretty
you don't
good.
need him. You don't need him to do it. You have Evan Solomon who did that as a job for years.
Yeah,
Get him
right.
out there and do that.
And he had him
Right?
in the
Like
safe
you
riding, right? He was going to walk in
right. He
anyway.
was in Toronto Center. Get him in there. He becomes the attack dog because he's been the attack dog when it comes to conservatives.
Yeah,
That's the route that they should have gone. Because here's the thing about Evan Solomon, because he's been in that position, he won't make the gaffes.
yeah, that's true.
Right. So you don't have to
And
worry
you know
about
what?
him
I'm
being a
not sure
politician.
Carney would make the gaffes either. I mean,
Right,
he made a
exactly.
gaffe in the French debate. In the
Mhm.
French leaders debate, not
Right.
leaders debate, the Liberal Party leader debate, and Chrystia
Oh.
Freeland, kind of presumptuously corrected him. I
Mhm.
don't think that helped her. She's like that. I'm a
Yeah.
huge. Dave knows I'm a 20-year fan of Chrystia Freeland, but she
Mhm.
of her writing in particular. But she can be that way, right? So
She could. I mean,
she corrected him, but that's the only gaffe I remember him actually making.
and that's in a second language.
Yeah, and
Right?
that's in
I
a
mean,
second
so
language. So I think his
right.
instincts were pretty good in English. Maybe he could have been told he
I
could be
think
more
it
aggressive.
I think it would have been better if they did a good cop bad cop thing. You
Yeah.
get Evan I mean, unless they don't have any intention of
You
putting
could have
Evan
even gotten
Solomon in a
her,
position.
unless she's too damaged
Yeah,
now,
you
Chrystia Freeland, because
yeah.
She was a for those who are in Canada and didn't get U.S. television in the years when Chrystia Freeland was based in the U.S. She was a liberal, or a Democratic Party
Right.
adjacent attack dog that would go on television and just attack. She would bark at
Right.
she was useful. That's why I loved her.
Right.
She would bark
Well,
at the conservative attack dogs
right.
that now are unchecked because the Democrats are so weak in this country.
And I would say Evan Solomon, for those people who might not know, if you're just getting into Canadian politics, is that he was the Chris Matthews,
Yeah.
I would say, and Chris Matthews is not light on people.
No. And
So,
Chrystia
but
Freeland
again,
would go on Chris Matthews' show and start screaming at Tony Blankley
right,
and Tucker Carlson and all these. Yeah, I was going to use a word that would get us an explicit rating, but those people,
right,
she
right,
would put them back in their place, which I
right,
enjoyed.
right. All right, so this was a little bit longer, but we
Yeah.
expected it to be because I'm still seeing what happens in Australia. Um, we have to, and that's another thing. We had two conservative leaders losing their own races for reelection. Peter Dutton probably will not be coming back to Parliament, whereas Pierre Poilievre will be. That's a story for the weeks ahead. Over the next few weeks, I'm probably, at least by myself, and with Kartik sometimes, going to continue to do the voting trend podcast. But we are going to go ahead and have a separate 11th province one. We're going to talk more about not just the elections, and we're going to talk about more governance and what's going on in the provinces, stuff like that. So, with that being the case, let's go ahead and end it today. Thank you all very much for joining both of us today. Exciting, interesting week, and we will see you next week. So, have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Bye bye.